go in this race.
What is Formula One? Well, it's car racing. Sort of. If you can call this a car. It's not exactly your mom's Prius, but you get the idea. Anyways, at its heart, F1 isn't just a race. It's a competition for clout between major car manufacturers. A mad dash for the right to say, we make the best shit, so you should probably buy it. If you want to know the origin of F1, you have to start with the car. The word car comes from the Gallic word karos for chariot, or the Middle English word car for the same, which probably came from the Latin word carus, which means a cartload, which is similar to a shit ton, but moves a lot easier. Anyways, the story of the car really begins in 1769, giggity, with the Frenchman named Nicolas Joseph Cugnot in a steam-driven wagon, which was made to move cannons. Then there was an Englishman in 1803 named Richard Trevithick, who got tired of London streets being covered in horseshit. So he invented the London steam carriage, which was more like a bus than a car. But that in turn led to the barn engine. That led to the tractor, which is exactly what was used in the very first motor race, the Great Race of 1878. With a grand prize of $10,000, M.G. Battis in his Oshkosh steam buggy, and E.P. Cowles in his Green Bay steamer pulled up to the line. Weighing in around 5 tons and averaging at 6 miles an hour, this 200-mile endurance race from Green Bay all the way to Madison lasted 33 hours and 27 minutes. With the Green Bay steamer having some technical difficulties while hitting a wall, Oshkosh steam buggy took the win. But as long as there's been motor racing, there's been a governing body trying to screw it up. In this case, the governing body being the Wisconsin state government, who didn't want to pay the $10,000 to the winner, because his ride was neither cheap nor practical. But they did eventually settle out of court for half the prize money being split between both guys, so I guess it worked out in the end. And meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean in Germany, an inventor named Carl Benz is making the first petrol-powered car, the Benz Motor Wagon No. 1, which no one wanted to buy. So in 1888, his wife Bertha decided to drive it from the city of Mannheim to Pforzheim and back, capturing the imagination of people and thrusting the motor wagon into the limelight as the first gas-powered car. And just in time for the very first Grand Prix. 1894, Paris, France. In an effort to sell some extra newspapers, a journalist for the French newspaper Le Petit Journal decided to host a race from Paris to Rouen called Concours de Moteur, a distance of about 76 miles or 122 kilometers on French dirt roads. A race where any type of motor-driven vehicle was allowed to enter, and enter they did, with 102 potential competitors signing up to race, with all types of alternative fuel-based motors, from gas-powered to steam-powered, and even some more questionable technologies like gravity-powered, or liquid-powered, automatic, electric, lever-powered, propellers, and even a pedal-powered car. Anyways, first they had a qualifying race. This had the dual purpose of whittling down the 102 entries to 26 viable competitors, while showcasing this spectacle of innovation to every set of eyeballs and the most famous city in the world. This was the ultimate challenge to decide the future of motorsports, with the winner poised to become the leading manufacturer by showcasing their superior design. Ultimately, this was a battle of powertrains, steam versus petrol. The stage was set for a battle of the ages to determine the future of motoring. And after 6 hours and 48 minutes of racing, Count de Dion finished in first place in his steam-powered car and carriage, just 3.5 minutes ahead of second and third place, both gas-powered cars from a little French company called Peugeot. And meanwhile, in a cafe somewhere in France, a French driver and an American millionaire are having a heated discussion about which country makes the best cars. And it went a little something like this. "You are an imbecile. France makes the best car in the whole world." "I beg to differ, old chap. I believe America makes the best cars, and I'm going to prove it to you." Little did anyone know that that drunken promise would lead to the foundation of Formula One. You see, that man who made that promise was James Gordon Bennett Jr., owner of the New York Herald. And at this point, France was absolutely dominating motor racing. This was due to a couple of factors, probably. Number one, French cars and drivers were just better in every way. You see, French road conditions at the time were absolutely terrible, which meant that French cars had to be more robust just to endure the French roads. And French drivers had to be highly skilled just to navigate them, not unlike Finnish drivers in modern F1. Number two, French automotive industry was the biggest in the world at the time, and as a result, the field would often be stacked in France's favor, with 8 out of 10 entries being French cars. Which brings us to number 3. Basically, every city-to-city race either started or ended in Paris, which usually put the French government in charge of the race, who I'm sure were totally unbiased in all of their rulings. So, to make sure things were more fair, Gordon Bennett met with the French Motoring Club, and they came up with a set of rules that they called a racing formula, which I'll list here. Anyways, they were responsible for a lot of concepts, like a racing season, a racing team, and most importantly, only national motor clubs could enter the race. The intended participating countries being Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, and the United States. Whereas in earlier races, anyone willing to fork up the dough could race, often resulting in hundreds of cars participating. Which brings us to the next rule. Each national club was limited to 3 cars, and those cars had to be manufactured entirely in the country they're representing. With the rules set for a fair competition, Formula Racing was born with the Gordon Bennett Cup in 1900. The first Gordon Bennett Cup was held in France, and the only 2 drivers that finished were French. Like I said, France dominated in the early days. So fast forward to 1903. The Gordon Bennett Cup is in its 4th year, and was hosted by Great Britain. But there was one problem. It was illegal to race on British roads.
Stop right there.
So they decided to have the race in Ireland. How British is that? Anyways, as a thank you to Ireland, the British racing team painted their car Shamrock Green, which is better known today as British Racing Green. You see, each country had a designated color to represent their country, and most chose a color that corresponds with their flag. Belgium chose yellow, France chose blue, Germany white, America red, Italy redder, which left Great Britain. In the previous year, they had won the race in the London-built Napier, who later made engines for Leyland Motors, but that's another story. Anyways, it was painted olive green in the 1902 race, until settling in on the deep emerald green that we all know today. So if you're British, thank an Irishman for your racing heritage. and maybe apologize for everything else. Anyways, Germany ended up winning the race in a Mercedes, with France taking second and third in Pinards. 1905 marked the last race of the Gordon Bennett series, being replaced by the 1906 French Grand Prix, who did not limit the number of cars that could be entered by each motor club. Unlike in the Gordon Bennett, where each nation was limited to 3 cars. The thought being that this race would better represent a country's manufacturing capacity. So, the 1906 French Grand Prix was held on public roads that were turned into a closed triangular circuit, which started in a little French town called Le Mans. One lap on this circuit was just over 100 kilometers, or 60 miles, and consisted of 12 laps for a total of over 1,200 kilometers, which after 2 days of racing was won by the Hungarian driver Frank Sitz in a Renault, with second place going to Felice Nazzaro in a Fiat, and third going to Albert Clement driving his Clement Bayard, which would eventually become Citroën in 1922, but that's another story. And a year later in 1907, Germany hosted its own Grand Prix called the Kaiser Prix. The race was held on public roads just north of Frankfurt, which was really dangerous, mainly because people just didn't realize that it was really dangerous, and would often just be standing on the racetrack as the cars are going flying by. And another reason being that there were 2 schools of thought when it came to car design. First being the Italian thought, where a small, light car would go fast through the turns. Then there's the German school of thought, where you take a giant car with a huge engine that can go really fast on the straights and really straight in the turns, which would result in some pretty spectacular crashes. But a side effect was that it did result in the most popular racing matchup, David versus Goliath, which would come to a crescendo in the last great race of an era, the 1914 French Grand Prix, which differed from all previous races. Firstly, the race would start side by side in a drag race, where they used to have a staggered start like modern rally races. This made it more exciting for the spectators and really conveyed the direct competition between drivers and car makers. Another difference was that the track was shorter at just 23 miles, split evenly between a stretch of technical turns that would require frequent gear changes and maneuverability, which favored smaller, more nimble French and Italian cars, followed by a long straight that would push your engine to all-out top speed, which favored the larger, heavier German cars, before ending in a sharp technical section, taking your brakes to their absolute limit before you cross the finish line. The third thing that made this race so important is when it happened. The race would start on the 4th of July in 1914, which was exactly 6 days after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, better known as the start of World War I. So you could say tensions were high, and a lot of people saw this as a peek into the greater conflict yet to unfold. The 2 favorites were French driver and winner of the 1912 French Grand Prix, Georges Boyot, in his nimble number 5 Peugeot EX5, built to tear up corners. And second, German driver Christian Lautenschlager, in his massive number 28 Mercedes 18100 GP, built to run at top speed all day. The race started head-to-head, with the Mercedes taking an early lead, utilizing its dominance in straight-line speed on the first section, the Peugeot being not far behind, waiting for its moment to strike. The French marque making up huge ground on the Mercedes with each turn in the technical section, before taking the lead halfway through the first lap. On the back straight, it was a lone Peugeot driven by Boyot fighting off 3 Mercedes. barely managing to keep his lead before slamming on his brakes for the final section. Pushing his Peugeot hard as ever, he managed to build a 2-minute lead over the course of 10 laps, until the final lap, when his car finally gave way to the strain of setting the pace. A heartbreaking end to the heroic French drive, and a total German victory with a 1-2-3 finish for Mercedes. And exactly 1 month later, all races, and international competition for that matter, completely halted as humankind tried its very best to erase itself from the face of the earth for over 4 years. Just 7 months after the last shot was fired, the sound of roaring engines would return to the speedway. 1919, the United States would host an international race called the Indianapolis 500 Miles Victory Sweepstakes, which one British writer described as fucking crazy dangerous. But these races differed from the European races, because they were primarily held on oval tracks that were formerly for horse races. Some important concepts were formed here, like a mass field start, and aerodynamics with front splitters and teardrop tails. The Indy 500 would also help give rise to a few names like Chevrolet and Ford in the coming years. But back over in war-torn Europe, racing had a slower and slightly smaller start, with smaller cycle cars on the battered French roads. The first race win going to a new company with a distinctly pear-shaped radiator called Bugatti. But it wouldn't be until 1921 that the first post-war Grand Prix would take place in Europe, in France, at Le Mans, which would be a nail-biting fight from start to finish between France and the United States, with France ultimately nosing out the competition for the win. But it was in 1922, for the French Grand Prix at Strasbourg, that would have its first mass field start in European Formula racing, with the veteran Italian driver Felice Nazzaro taking an early lead in his Fiat and holding despite all odds against multiple Bugattis. This was the beginning of Italian dominance in Formula racing, with Italian makers taking first place in nearly 50% of races over the next decade, with a few of those victories going to a young driver for Alfa Romeo named Enzo Ferrari, whose company would cut its teeth on a track that would also be built soon, called Monza. The 1920s were a special time for Formula racing, and a lot of names and places were brought to prominence. But that is a story for next time.